Hello guys, this is the Captain Hook for a new video, and today it's also a great day because we have the opportunity to have a great guest with us. We have Brin-Jonathan BUTLER with us. Brin, hello.
Hello, thank you for having me.
And thank you for the opportunity, Brin. It's you're someone that I wanted to speak with since a long time, since I read your book, The Domino Diaries, an excellent book. I already recommended in an older video your book, and that's great to have you here today because with you we can go deep on an aspect that's really fascinating for many boxing fans. This is the boxing from Cuba. Yes.
Perfect.
Yes, and Brin, first question, because you're a boxing writer, don't you think that the highest level, the last step of a hardcore boxing fan is to become a boxing writer?
I think there's a lot of truth to that because, I mean, you have to spend a lot more time with the sport up close and go behind the scenes, get a backstage pass into who these people are, into how the sport is run. And ideally, because one of the wonderful things about boxing is you have people from around the world participating in it, is to go to their countries to really learn what these fighters mean and represent to the countries that they come from. So yeah, I think that's a pretty accurate statement to say that many boxing writers are tremendous fans. Sometimes it can be the opposite, that they can be a little more judgmental and critical in ways that I think they lose the openness to what it's about, because it's easy to get cynical with a sport like boxing that doesn't have the best reputation in terms of how it treats the fighters. But I think there are many examples of writers who I watch them in press row since I've been covering the sport for about 10 years, and some of them are as excited as any of the fans who are losing their minds during exciting moments with boxing.
Yeah. Also agree, and maybe it's something that I have to become, also a boxing writer to really complete my life as a hardcore boxing fan. So, as you say, Brin, you covered the sport since many years. It's not just a book that you wrote. You wrote also many times for the Ring magazine.
Mm-hmm.
Some edition of Ring with your article on here, like this one, also this one. So tell me, Brin, what was the piece of work that for Ring magazine that you enjoyed the most doing it?
I love the history of Ring magazine. It's almost 100 years old, so that, especially in a country like America, that is an exceptionally old magazine. I think it predates the New Yorker, it predates Esquire, it predates a lot of these premium magazines. So to be connected to its history is quite a privilege. I think the piece that I've most enjoyed with Ring has been, also the subject of my book, Rigondeaux, the Cuban two-time Olympic champion and world champion, to illuminate a little bit more of his backstory for readers that maybe were unaware of the journey that he made to come over. Those are the most meaningful. I think there can be a lot of fun in also talking about stuff that's topical, discussing the current heavyweight situation when we have a new era where briefly you had Anthony Joshua and Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury all being undefeated, being, exciting to speculate about what might happen should they fight in the future and sort of help bring back boxing to prominence, which I think it still is extraordinarily popular in certain European countries, but in America, it's definitely more of a challenge to reach a mainstream audience than it's been historically with the other sports competing with it. So Ring has been a good opportunity I think my favorite was to offer. I went back to Cuba and I took some pictures of the Rafael Trejo gym, one of Cuba's most famous gyms in Havana, and yeah, there you go. So that is actually the gym where, when I was, 300 years ago, training as an amateur boxer, that was somewhere where I trained with a two-time Olympic champion named Hector Vinent. And almost every great Cuban champion that there's been in the country's history has trained there in the open air. So you have kind of the magic of its history, and at the same time, children that might show up. Any one of them could become the next Teofilo Stevenson or Guillermo Rigondeaux or Felix Sabon. And that was an exciting thing to be around. Also, just with the absence of, there was just no, like, as you can see from the photograph that you showed, it's a gymnasium that you wouldn't be able to find in a slum in New York. So it's incredible that a facility where there's so little money invested in it, that nonetheless, with the intelligence of trainers and with the natural talent and drive and courage and discipline of the fighters, have been able to create the most powerful amateur boxing program in history. Yes. So just to be a tourist in that was a spectacular thrill.
Yes, we will speak about the program later. Just a question, because your book was published in 2015, and this great article was in 2016. Ring Magazine asked you about for this article because of your book. There were a connection?
There was certainly a connection. I mean, there were more and more Cuban fighters. When I first went to Cuba in 2000, it was an exceptionally rare thing for Cuban boxers to leave. And by about the middle of my time there, between when I first went to when the book was published in 2015, Guillermo Rigondeaux left, along with some other Olympic champions, and Odlianier Solis, Yuri Ortiz Gamboa, yes, who became a world champion. So it seemed like it was kind of a dividing line when I first went. With the Cuban fighters were very famous for staying and turning down money, to a new phase where if you had the talent to make real money as a professional, most of them seemed to be leaving. And that was really the story of the book that I was trying to tell, was to explore the values of this country and the values of the United States once these athletes either succeeded in leaving, or what was the repercussions of them staying. So in 2016, there was a momentous event with Obama opening up the doors. Havana that year was the most searched location for travel in the world. So there was a huge amount of curiosity about what Cuba was. And just by accident of my travels there, the Cuba that's depicted in the book you were holding up is no longer something or somewhere that people can visit, because it's changed so dramatically since then. So 2016, with Obama opening it up, it became something entirely new again. And now the landscape of the island, and especially Havana, the most visited part of it, is just a very, very different place. And I'm sure that the influx of tourism and money prior to the pandemic closing all of that off benefited a lot of people, but it also gave rise to a lot of income inequality, and definitely changed the flavor and atmosphere that I think I was trying to share with readers, which was so inexplicable and unusual compared to anything I'd ever seen in my life, coming from where I had with my exposure to boxing outside of Cuba.
Yes, because we have to see that, and we can speak about it's really an odyssey that you did with this book, and you did that travel before the embargo was less strict. So in the book you explain also that sometimes you had to go to Madrid to fly to Cuba because it was easier this way.
There were issues with
Yeah.
the work that I was doing there because you're not, at that time, it's changed a lot now, but at that time it was very, very difficult to go there with a professional camera and film these Cuban athletes, especially the elite athletes. And the boxers in particular that I was interviewing were the most famous ones on the island: Teofilo Stevenson, Felix Sabone, Hector Vinent being a two-time Olympic champion, and also interviewing the family of Guillermo Rigondeaux, where there were security cameras preventing, monitoring this family, because his escape became a kind of referendum for the whole country about why all Cubans wished for change, at a minimum change, and maybe at the extreme, to give you a good example, in 2000, I'd say maybe of 20 or 30 friends that I made from that first trip, by 2015, when the book was published, probably 95% of those people my age had left. So it tells you a bit where the generational gaps were in terms of attitude about the incentives to stay or to leave. And so, as you can understand, it became very problematic to allow people to speak openly about their reasons about why they would want to leave or why they would want things to change in a system where all the media is controlled.
Yeah.
And so I was breaking some laws to gain access to these people.
You have a political police also that are almost
Yes.
everywhere. Yes. And you're right. The figure of Guillermo Rigondeaux will be predominant in your book, and it's a book also that make in perspective the path in the pro boxing of Guillermo Rigondeaux. For example, you put me back in perspective, because you explain at some point that Guillermo Rigondeaux was already since 2 years in the US, starting his career, and he didn't see, didn't speak, didn't have any contact with his family in the island. And that's we have to reconsider the toughness of his career, for sure, because sometimes we just speak about boxing, just about the sport, or maybe the performance wasn't there. But when you realize all he has to do, it's really great. And only in your book had the feeling that strong feeling. Thank you for that, Brin. But speaking about Guillermo Rigondeaux, that for you, in your eyes, was the most amazing athlete you see?
Oh, no question. No, I mean, it was. I've had the opportunity to see a few athletes who I think were world quality in bullfighting. Jose Tomas is, by many experts, considered the greatest bullfighter who ever lived. Rigondeaux, to me, with all of the discussion about Floyd Mayweather being the greatest boxer of this era, which I'm not even sure if he was. Personally, I would say Roy Jones in his prime was a better one. But definitely the achievements of Floyd Mayweather are extraordinary. I thought Rigondeaux, in his prime especially, could do everything that Mayweather was capable of, except he was a puncher as well. He was an extraordinary knockout puncher if he could land cleanly, which Mayweather was not. If you looked at the knockout percentage of Guillermo, and I think almost every opponent that he faced up until toward the end, as he was getting quite old, he knocked down or knocked out all of them. And I just don't think he got enough credit, because I think there was a lot of some of the boxing writers who were out there were very critical of his style in a way that they were not critical of Floyd Mayweather, despite I don't think Mayweather was making more action-friendly fights. Quite the contrary. But because Mayweather was making a lot more money, it was in the interest of some of those writers to maintain access to him and celebrate his victories, even though I've never seen a champion of his quality or anywhere close to his quality more willing to be booed than Floyd Mayweather. But Rigondeaux gained a reputation very quickly with especially his great victory over Nonito Donaire,
Yes.
who at that time was the ESPN Fighter of the Year, had a string of incredible knockouts to win that title and defend it. And Rigondeaux, I thought, gave such a tremendously dominant performance.
Oh, yes, it's a masterclass. It's a masterclass.
It was a masterclass, and yet it almost ruined his entire career commercially.
Yeah, yes, it's a masterclass for sure. But times fly. We are a few years later, and I want to hear from you your feeling about this fight and your reaction about this fight. I show you Lomachenko and Rigondeaux. It's I'm pretty sure it's a I'm pretty sure it's a mixed feeling. I still spoke a lot about this fight with my friends and with my followers because Rigondeaux was and Lomachenko for my people in France, it's the best of the best. You cannot top these two guys. But the story of the fight and how the fight goes, you stay with a mixed feeling that is not that great. What was your reaction?
Well, my reaction was, I love Vasily Lomachenko, one of the most talented fighters I think that there's ever been in the sport. Incredibly intelligent, incredibly disciplined, but the dynamics of how they fought really dictated the result. So, for example, that it was 2 weight classes above where Rigondeaux should have been fighting.
And size matter.
Which Lomachenko, to his credit, pointed out. He said, what is this achievement? This achievement is me beating somebody who's fighting at a weight class they have no business fighting at. And also, Rigondeaux was old at that point. So I'm not saying definitively that the Rigondeaux who fought in the 2000 or 2004 Olympics would have beaten him if they were at the same weight. But I think you're seeing now Lomachenko fighting at a larger weight class. He is not looking anywhere near as dominant as he had at 126 or 130, as he's fighting 135 size fighters, larger people, or whose natural weight are more around 135. He's been knocked down. He had some issues. I mean, he lost an early fight being sort of muscled around. He rebounded from that incredibly. But I think the dynamics of the fight with Rigondeaux at that time were just, everything was in Lomachenko's favor as far as the timing and the size, which doesn't take away from his victory, and certainly making Rigondeaux quit the way he did was red meat for all of Rigondeaux's critics, who could say, look, the moment he's challenged and he has a major obstacle to overcome, he just gives up with kind of a lame excuse, claiming a broken hand, which turned out to be a bruise. But I was at that fight. I interviewed both of the fighters before it. I think that they're both 2 of the greatest fighters that the sport has ever had as far as talent. But this was Rigondeaux at a very advanced age, at a tremendous size disadvantage. And as I say, to Lomachenko's credit, he pointed that out as soon as it was over. I would have loved to have seen that fight, let's say, I don't know, 8 years earlier at, say, 126 pounds. I don't know if Rigondeaux wins that fight, but I would say if they fought 10 times, it's hard for me to imagine Rigondeaux not winning 4 or 5 of those, because of the smaller weight classes, as I'm sure you know, these guys mature a lot quicker than the big guys. The first thing you're losing as a professional boxer is foot speed, coordination, reaction time. Well, this is of paramount importance for 2 people who are so extraordinarily skilled. And you could see some flashes of Rigondeaux moving, pivoting, recalibrating his movements in ways that Lomachenko had never had a dance partner who could do some of the things that he was doing. But at the time that they met, Lomachenko was still, I would say, he looked too sophisticated, but also just his athletic ability. He was much younger, and he was much bigger, much more comfortable at that weight class. And I think those factors dictated a fight where he was dominant. I wish it would have happened earlier and smaller. I also know that Rigondeaux was offered that fight at a lower weight class earlier on. He rejected it. So in a sense, he deserves, the circumstances in which he had to take the fight. Rigondeaux has not done himself any favors in terms of the fights that he's taken when he's taken them. He has damaged his marketability, and that fight was a tremendous blow to his legacy. In some ways, in some people's eyes, I mean, he's not really come back from that fight with any big ones. But I wish it would have happened under slightly more even circumstances.
Yes, and maybe what's pushed the frustration further is that Rigondeaux wanted the fight. He pushed for the fight, you know, on the social media for the weeks and weeks and weeks, and it wasn't his habit, you know. It wasn't something that he'd done in the past, you know. Even trying the trash talking was not his things, and see Rigondeaux pushing for this fight, you know. It was a mixed feelings. Just even before the fights happened, he felt weird. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, he needed the money. I mean, and as we were saying earlier with Donaire, I felt that if Floyd Mayweather had done to Manny Pacquiao what Rigondeaux did to Donaire, it would have been considered one of the greatest fights of the 21st century in terms of a master class of a great boxer against a Hall of Fame boxer. When Rigondeaux does it, it's sort of, did we overrate Donaire? This was boring.
And look what Donaire did with Inoue.
Well, that's exactly it. So you can see that Donaire is still a tremendously dangerous fighter. And Rigondeaux's skill, who was a 3-1 underdog in that fight, let's remember. 3-1. And the odds might have been worse in some places to place a bet on it. But you could see after the first round, it's ironic to me that Rigondeaux gets criticized for making that a boring fight. The reason it was a boring fight is because the moment Donaire tasted his power in the first round, he was willing to just survive for 12 rounds. And he barely did that. But had he engaged the way he was beginning to in the first round, the way he'd knocked out these other solid fighters previous to that fight, he recognized that he was going to be knocked out quickly, that he couldn't make a mistake, that he had no plan B for what Rigondeaux was offering in that fight. He wasn't able to find any openings, and that he was getting countered so viciously that he was in danger of getting stopped badly. So he proceeded to not throw any punches for the remainder of the fight. I don't understand why he doesn't get any of the blame for it not being as exciting a fight as I guess some people wanted, because he's the puncher. He's the one knocking everybody out, and he knows he's fighting a counterpuncher. So it's odd to me that Rigondeaux gets so much blame when Pernell Whitaker or Floyd Mayweather, you know what you're getting with somebody who's a counterpuncher. It's just that with Rigondeaux, what's different from those two great defensive geniuses is if you make a mistake, he can knock you out, where that was not true with Pernell Whitaker very often, and certainly not true with Floyd Mayweather. And Donaire was a great example of just how dominant a fighter Rigondeaux was at that time. And keep in mind that this was Rigondeaux at 33 years old.
Yeah, and
this is somebody well past their athletic prime.
But maybe to give some props to Floyd, maybe Rigondeaux was the guy of one division. And it's just normal, you know, it's just the nature of your body, you know. And Floyd was still successful in a bigger weight, because even for him, you know, welterweight was big for him.
Oh, no question. I mean, Floyd, like Pacquiao, climbed many, many weight classes in a virtually I'm not taking anything away from Floyd. I think Floyd's career is exemplary. He's absolutely one of the greatest fighters ever. But Floyd was able to benefit from taking most of his biggest fights at an ideal time to suit Floyd, after about the time of Arturo Gatti or certainly Oscar De La Hoya. He was getting guys at opportune times for Floyd, whereas the A side, he was able to control the entire dynamics of the negotiation. That's something that Rigondeaux never had an opportunity to do because he was never marketable. So I give Floyd credit for putting himself in that position. Prior to him being an A-side fighter, he took a lot of tough fights and he fought a lot more exciting fights. Yeah. And he always had hand problems that was an issue throughout his career. But you look, it's not an accident that nobody is clamoring to really rewatch Floyd Mayweather's greatest fights now that he's retired, because they weren't particularly memorable fights.
And
Although,
yes, and maybe the best fight. I'm completely agree with you. Thank you, Brin, because when we spoke about Floyd and his greatest fight, people are confused. They spoke about the greatest fight in terms of business, not in terms of
that's
sport.
right.
You know, because for me, one of these greatest fight is against Chop Chop Corley. But who's speaking about this fight?
Sure.
Nobody. Everybody will speak again against, I don't know, Mosley or De La Hoya. But what he done prior to Gatti, I'm completely agree with you. It's something else. Yes. Brin, I want to go back to about your knowledge about the Cuban boxing, because I also have something I wanted to ask you, because you're the perfect guy for that. Are you surprised that the school of boxing, if I can say, from Cuba, was for a long time was isolated? You know, they don't open the door and to other nation. And now, since few years now, you see that Cuban trainer become head in charge with other nation. For example, France. Once again, you have to know that in the Olympic team in France is coached by a Cuban.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it's pretty new. But are you surprised about that change of politics about the Cuban sport, and let the trainer go overseas to train the amateur national team?
Well, they really didn't have a choice, because so many of the athletes had left. I mean, almost everybody who could make money to leave was trying to leave or had left. And the same was true of the coaches. So they needed to come up with some kind of compromise, much in the way that a lot of people first heard about Cuba's great music scene from Buena Vista Social Club. Well, Buena Vista Social Club also was allowed to tour around, and the government worked out a deal so that they could keep some of their money from touring, and then they could come home, like completely contrary to how every other Cuban musician was able to operate. And the same was true with the athletes, is if there's no way to keep them, you're forced to come up with some kind of compromise. And same with the coaches, because almost all of these Cuban coaches have PhDs. You know, there's been such a tremendous investment by the government into educating them to put them in the position that they're in, where how do you keep these people with such marketable skills that they've demonstrated in the amateurs, unless you come up with something to incentivize that they can go away for a little while, train other nations, and they can send that money home. And you also have the leverage that they don't want to entirely leave, because most of these people have families back home. So they're afraid of what could happen to their families if they do leave. So it's a pretty logical progression from my point of view, that these coaches, and probably, the way they opened up the World Series of boxing, so it's sort of semi-professional to allow the Cubans to make a little bit more money as athletes. We saw it with baseball before boxing, that a lot of the Cuban athletes and coaches didn't really know where they stood at the professional level. And once somebody like El Duque, Orlando Hernandez, comes over as a much older man to pitch for the New York Yankees, he makes such an immediate impact that the Yankees win the World Series. And his brother, Livan Hernandez, had done the same thing in Miami a year or two before, I believe. So the Cubans finally, who would hear that back on the island, that if we have old guys who could go over to the U.S. and have an instant impact, imagine what our stars could do. And so once that awareness happened of how talented they were relative to the rest of the world, the government had a major problem on their hands of keeping these people when it's only 90 miles to get to the U.S. to compete, and essentially be like an uncashed lottery ticket, provided they can just step foot on American soil. For your listeners who are not familiar with the law, it's called wet foot, dry foot, where a Cuban has the fastest means of becoming an American citizen of any immigrant or refugee in the world. All they have to do is step foot on American soil. And it's not because Americans are that interested in Cuban athletes or music, it's to destabilize the government. And so another byproduct of this is that about 30% of the Cubans who left the island to try to make it to the United States drowned trying to make that journey. And the United States, by creating this incentive to come over, I think bears some of the responsibility for the loss of those lives, as much as the conditions that the Cuban government had created as well, along with the embargo, that would make people want to leave. So it's a complex sort of nexus of reasons that are involved here about why these people are staying and leaving. And most of the time we just see them go in and fight and then they leave, but we don't know what's behind the stories.
Yes.
And it's often there's some impressive stories.
And this book, for my people, this book explain extremely well that, and it's I learned so much. Thank you, Brin, again for your work about that. So speaking about the sport, the Cuban boxing in the Olympic was the best for decades and decades and decades. You know, it was the pinnacle of what boxing can provide in the Olympics. But I wanted to share my view. Maybe the best win at the Olympics, because he won against a crazy good Cuban, was maybe this guy. Are you agree with me? Leonard Sugar Ray.
Well, one of the great fighters of all time, no question.
No question. But 76 in Montreal. Mm-hmm. Don't you think that the performance he put on at the last stage on the final against an amazing athlete is, in my opinion, the best win in the Olympics? Are you agree, or maybe did you see some great final better than him?
I think it's definitely one of them for sure. I mean, and again, like, just to put this in context, though, is you have America with 320 million people and the richest country in the world fighting a country that has 9 or 10 million people, that is a third world country, with no resources whatsoever relative to what the U.S. has, and consistently has totally dominated the U.S. in their chosen American sports of boxing and baseball. So, so I give full credit to, Sugar Ray Leonard is one of the all-time greats, and the Cuban team was notorious of being so incredibly dominant. Their most dominant year being 1992, where they won, I think, every gold medal except one. But I think you're right. I think what Sugar Ray Leonard did there was, one of those special moments in Olympic boxing history.
Yeah. And speaking about Sugar Ray, and I wanted to ask you if you know the story. I'm pretty sure you know, because I'm pretty sure it's one of your favorite fighters too. It's not Sugar Ray, it's the Nemesis. It's this guy. And do you know... And I don't know if you wrote this biography, autobiography from Roberto Duran, but he was almost kidnapped for a day from Fidel Castro. Did you?
I didn't know that.
Did you? It's in the book.
I've never heard that.
I don't remember if it was in Panama or another country, and he wake up one day with the Fidel Castro guys. He take a plane for one day to see a fight with Fidel Castro, and the fight was a fight from the great champ, the heavyweight. I have a
Teofilo Stevenson?
Stevenson, yes. And Roberto Duran, kidnapped by Castro, starting an argument with Fidel Castro, and Roberto Duran was a Ali guy. Muhammad Ali. He said, no, Muhammad Ali is so much better than your guy, in the face of Fidel Castro in Cuba,
Wow.
And yeah, that's a crazy story, and I was sure it was a story that you like.
I've never heard that story before, but
it's in the book.
If anybody's going to say it to Fidel Castro and get away with it, it would have to be Roberto Duran, probably my favorite all-time fighter.
Oh yes, me too. This guy, it's crazy good. The Domino Diaries, great book from Brin, my friends. You have to read it, and it's not just about Cuba and your odyssey with the Cuba culture, the Cuba island, and the Cuba boxing. You start the book with also a crazy story. You can compare with the one with Roberto Duran. You have to explain, Brin, your meeting with this guy. Up. It's not on my... Oh, sorry. With this guy, I don't have the picture, with Mike Tyson.
Okay, yes.
You have to explain, because this is the first page. This is the first page of the book.
Mm-hmm.
It's your introduction. And it's completely crazy. Are you crazy, Brin?
Well, it's true. I had an interesting opportunity interviewing both Tyson's former trainer and Rigondot's former trainer, current trainer at that time, which was Freddie Roach, in Los Angeles at the Wildcard Gym. And we had a good interview, and Mike Tyson had been very important to me when I was a little kid, in that I heard about the bullying that he'd experienced. And so he was somebody I used to watch Mike Tyson documentaries almost every day, trying to practice shadow boxing from him. I would run at 4 a.m, 5 days a week like him, cut my hair like him. So it was an identity and an obsession. And so with Freddie Roach, I knew, because he had trained him, there was a possibility that he would have his phone number. So at the end of interviewing about Rigondot, which went very well, I asked him if there'd be a way, if I could, how would he recommend that I reach out to Mike Tyson? And very generously, he said, I have no idea. And then he put out his phone and said, but you could start with his phone number, and gave me his phone number. But the problem is Mike Tyson doesn't answer his own phone. He has an assistant who answers his phone. So Freddie warned me that you're never going to get through to him, because you're going to have to deal with Daryl, who is his assistant. And so I called Daryl for the next month and a half, probably 150 times or something. And like a good Canadian, was very polite, but very persistent, and finally got to an invitation to come to Las Vegas. And when I showed up at Las Vegas, he said, you can meet me at the Excalibur Hotel. We'll rent out the conference room, and you can interview Mike. Because if you're friends with Freddie Roach, you can interview him. And I showed up at the Excalibur Hotel and talked to the staff, and they said, we have no idea who you are, and Mike Tyson is absolutely not coming to the Excalibur Hotel to talk with you. And I made one last phone call to Daryl and said, they don't know who I am, and they don't know you. Can you help me here? And he said, well, just come to the house. And that's where the address was given to me, about 12 miles outside of Las Vegas. And I don't even think he talked to Tyson at that point to say, some guy is coming over. And I think the reason why he gave me the address is he knew that somebody was working on a biography of Freddie Roach, and they assumed that I was him. And because they said, we think you're from Boston. Is your name Peter or something? And whatever they wanted to hear, I just said, yes, like I'm here for that. I don't have much time. I'll come out to see you. And so walking into his front door, there was a lot of marijuana smoke. I mean, he was an incredible consumer of marijuana back then. Now it's legal, and he's got a marijuana farm and all this kind of thing. But he was back then a very big user. I didn't know that until I walked into it. And it took about 5 minutes to sort of figure out where Tyson was inside of his house. It was very dark inside. And when I looked up, I saw the back of a leather couch and this kind of, it looked like a globe that you would spin. But it turned out to be the back of his head because he turned to face me. And the look was sort of that look that he would bring to the center of the ring just before he would fight an opponent. And I thought, this is not a very good sign. And he then put the phone down, got up, walked down the stairs, still glaring the entire time. So it was very much a sort of nightmare situation, like didn't feel like reality. And am I allowed to swear on your program?
Yes.
So as he's walking towards me, glaring, said, "How did this white motherfucker get into my house?" And I had to think very quickly about how to justify my presence in this man's living room, and got very lucky and had an hour there. Now, I had brought some people there with cameras, not professional people, but some people who couldn't believe that I was actually going to Mike Tyson's house at that time. I'd never written anything professionally. I'd never published anything. I was not a documentary filmmaker. I just told people that I had Mike Tyson's private number, and one of those people actually paid for the trip to go to Las Vegas to do it. And then the moment we arrived, Tyson said, "There's no way you're going to film me in my fucking house. So we'll talk, but you're not going to film it or anything." So I kind of, as soon as it was over, wrote everything down as quickly as I could to the best of my memory. And that's the scene it opens with, because it was really the beginning, I think, of my journalism career, which I didn't know that I was kind of auditioning for when I walked into his house. I went there because he meant a lot to me as a little kid.
Yeah, that's a crazy story, almost crazier than Hangover. So, and it's in the book. Last question, Brin, because we love the boxer on the ring who box with style, but your writing is also with style. So, tell me the writer that you look up to establish your style. I know this guy is important for you.
Yes, Hemingway was very important to me. I mean, Hemingway's relationship to Cuba was very important to me. And the way that Cuba responded to Hemingway was very important to me. I think Hemingway has a reputation of being macho and sort of tough and masculine, but what you hear a lot less of is it's not a very aggressive, stereotypically American attitude to learn how to speak 5 languages and to spend almost your entire adult life in other countries.
Yeah.
And that seems to me a very humble, respectful, ideal traveler who wants to learn from other cultures, and be open, and instead of being a great talker, to be a great listener of other people's stories. And many of his great stories are other people's stories that he didn't get in the way of and listen to and then put down in his own words. But I would say the writer that influenced me the most with that book, because I didn't know that you could write a book that was sort of impressionistic and allowing complexity to a story that historically is pretty much always, I'm on America's team or I'm on Cuba's team, I'm on capitalism's team or I'm on communism's team. I wasn't on anybody's team. And I just wanted to talk to everybody who had written about it, or all these boxers, to see if I could find them myself to speak for themselves and try to not get in the way and allow the complexity of them telling their stories to make you think about your own life and your own story in a different way. And the writer who offered a perspective on that was a guy named Michael Hare, who most famously wrote a book about Vietnam called Dispatches. And what's interesting about Michael Hare, also, some of you may have seen Apocalypse Now. The narration of that entire film, which is beautifully narrated, is written by Michael Hare, and many scenes in that story are from his book Dispatches. And I thought if he is writing a book that's impressionistic with no clear narrative for Vietnam, I could look at the Cuba American Cold War struggle as a kind of version of that, where there's no attacks or anything. I mean, there was the Bay of Pigs invasion by the Americans, but look at the Cold War struggle and sort of embed myself in the lives of many different Cubans with many different perspectives, and not try to impose what people should think about it, but just offer a portrait of a time and place that already is dated. It's already a time capsule of Cuba, and after Obama lifted all the restrictions and they went to go to Cuba, I've had many people read the book, write to me to ask to meet the people that I met, or could I learn boxing from Olympic champions or whatever. And there's lots of stuff that's there that's wonderful to visit, but what I've written about is no longer there. It's changed, and it's changed considerably. Until about 2008, 2009, there were no cell phones in Cuba that I ever saw, and now they're everywhere. When Obama visited, the Rolling Stones performed the biggest concert in Cuban history, and it wasn't, for me, as remarkable that the Rolling Stones were doing a world-class concert. It's that every Cuban who was there, because it was free and 400,000 Cubans attended, it's that they all were holding up their iPhones just like everywhere else to record the event rather than to watch it. Yeah. And that's a very different place than the place I'm writing about, where my fondest memories are going to Kid Chocolate Arena and everybody's drinking rum and smoking cigarettes and cigars as the people are fighting. These world-class fighters are fighting, and there's no cameras and there's no advertising, and it's free for everybody to watch. And that was a very magical time and place to witness that. It still doesn't seem quite real in my mind to think back on it.
Yes, and you really, if I can say, you really captured this in this book. So I hope an editor in France will watch the video, and we will start to translate that great book, because it has to be. It really has to be. Thank you for this really great piece of work, the Domino Diaries from Brin-Jonathan BUTLER. Brin, it was a pleasure to speak with you today, and I wish you the best. Hopefully, maybe another book. I don't know if you if you have the idea to write about boxing for another book.
I would like to. I just finished a book on chess for Simon & Schuster called The Grandmaster. Chess was actually quite a similar kind of group of people who were fans, just as weird as boxing people. But I would like, if I found the right story, I would love to do another book on boxing, or a boxer, or something to do with it. Okay. Thank you for your time. This was fun to talk with you.
Thank you. The Domino Diaries. Brin, thank you so much. And guys, see you soon. Bye-bye. Boom!